Okay, so hopefully you can now all see my screen. Let me know if there's any issues. We are Conservation Optimism. So if you've never heard of us, we are an organization that wants everyone to feel empowered to act for nature. And so we do that by reframing the narrative away from the doom and gloom, but we also have lots of different activities and do lots of different types of creative communication. So we kind of target lots of different audience, be it kids, teenagers, adults, conservationists, or the broader public. And we're very excited to share with you some tips today on what we've learned when it comes to covering the climate and biodiversity crisis from a solutions lens. So just to give you a bit of an idea of the outline of the session, so we are going to go first into like a little bit of an intro, tell you a bit more about the doom and gloom narrative and framing and conservation optimism and what we do. Then we will go into specifically the climate and biodiversity crisis in the media and talk to you about some work we've done with journalists here in the UK. And then we will go into the positive communication toolkit. So talking about what is framing, why you're communicating, your values and beliefs, and then certain communication traps and how to avoid them. And then we will have a part about creative communication specifically. Then we'll have a short break so that everyone can go to the bathroom if they need to, get a refill on your cup of tea and coffee. And then we'll have exercises in breakout rooms, so then you'll get to do things as well. So it's not just us talking for 2 hours. So to get us started, Munib is going to put in the chat the link of Mentimeter, and that will allow you to vote to give us your answer to this question. So to get us started, if you could tell us if you feel optimistic about the future of nature, yes, no, sometimes. If you can feel it, I'm going to show you on my screen as well the results as they come in. So, oops. Okay, so far we've got quite a few sometimes. We've got a few no's. Ooh, the no's are increasing. We've got a yes. Give you a few more minutes to, well, a few more seconds to fill it in. Munib should be able to share with you as well the link so that you can see the live results. Okay, so 2 people feel optimistic. We've got a lot of sometimes, which is fair. It's hard to be optimistic all the time. Quite a few no's as well. Okay, so that's a good starting point to know where we're at. So if we go back to the presentation now, we have a second question for you, and that is, what is your biggest challenge when communicating about environmental issues? So we want to understand a bit more about you and you know, what are the challenges that you might be facing when talking about issues. So, you know, you don't need to be working in conservation, but if you're like doing activism, we want to hear from you. So you should now be able to answer the question. So let me know. So far I can't see anyone, so I don't know if that's because it's not working or because nobody has any challenges. I can't see the chat, so can someone tell me, Munib, if there's any issues with this slide? Oh, it's coming. Okay, perfect. So I can see here, we're getting a nice word cloud. So I can see wider public comms, the fear of greenwashing, which, yeah, it's a good point. Values, ignorance, cognitive dissonance, that's an interesting one. Making your message heard, the platforms, lack of confidence. Oops, sorry, I'm just going to close this because it's getting very bright in here. Ignorance is quite big, so it must have been quite a few. Make people understand. People feeling attacked, yeah, that's another interesting one. I think I've missed a few. Not be catastrophic. Arrogance, that's an interesting one. So you can keep inputting your ideas if you want, and we'll be able to save the word cloud at the end. So that's great to kind of like know what your challenges are. And so if we go back to the presentation now, we just wanted to tell you a bit more about who we are as well. So I'm Julia, the Director of Conservation Optimism, and I'm specializing in science communication and outreach. Before working for Conservation Optimism, I used to work for Chester Zoo. I was the science communication officer there. And I have a mixed background in journalism and applied ecology. So I did 2 different degrees. And so you can see at the bottom here, there's the logo of Incline, and that's a media platform, an international media platform I started, I co-founded, and it's all about positive journalism, solutions-based journalism, and featuring stories of what people are doing to make the world better. Now I'm going to pass on to Munib. Munib, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you so much, Julia. And thanks everyone for being here. It's such a pleasure to speak to everyone today. I'm Munib. I'm sort of a conservationist / researcher by training, but I'm also part of Conservation Optimism through being the India Hub coordinator. So as Julia said, Conservation Optimism is all about spreading sort of positive, inspiring stories. And one way to sort of spread these stories, but also connect with people, is by building different regional networks. And me being from India, I was inspired to build one back home. So just trying to work towards, more conservation optimism related network building back home. So that's a bit about me.
And Sophia, do you want to go next? Introduce yourself as well.
Sure. My internet is not the best, so I'm sorry if you can't hear me very well, but yeah, I'm Sophia. I manage creative communications at Conservation Optimism. I'm in Mexico right now, and I saw that there's someone else from there here too. And yeah, so when I am not managing creative communications for CO, I also am a PhD student in marine conservation at the University of Oxford. And sort of have experience. So I co-host the Good Natured podcast with Julia, and then also co-organize the Good Natured Film Festival with her as well. I'll tell you.
And you can see at the bottom of the slide as well that Conservation Optimism, we have different partners, and we're funded through the University of Oxford, the Weekly Fund for Nature, and Synchronicity as well, so key partners. And I forgot to say earlier, but also please, when we ask you a question on Mentimeter, feel free to answer in your native language. So if English is not your primary language, please feel free to answer in a different language. And yes, we'll make sure as well to translate future questions in the few different languages that we do know how to speak. Okay, so as I said in the outline, the first part of this workshop is going to be looking at the climate and biodiversity crisis in the media. And so that's based on some work that we've done here in the UK. So first of all, I'd be quite curious, feel free to put your thoughts in the chat, but I'd be quite curious when you look at how the environmental issues are usually portrayed in the media. Would you say that it's usually quite positive, or would you say it's quite doom and gloom? Because what we have found personally is that very often there is this kind of very doom and gloom narrative. And I've put a few examples here. You can see mega projects pushing forests past tipping point. More of a quarter of UK mammal faced extinction. Some are really dramatic, like the insect apocalypse is here. Plastic is an unfolding disaster. So when we looked at the media overall, we noticed that a lot of the environmental issues had that kind of negative framing associated with them. And it was very often about the challenges, but not so much about the solutions. But that has started to change, and there are more and more media platforms now that are reporting on solutions rather than just the challenges. And I think there's a real appetite, especially from younger audiences, to have more of these solutions, to know what's happening and how they can help. And at Conservation Optimism, we really believe that having that action and solutions framework makes people feel more empowered. We feel that if it's only pushing the negative, and obviously there are many challenges, we're not saying that everything is fine and nobody needs to do anything, but we're saying that if you put an action or a solution and showcase what people are trying to do, or even talk about a failure, but from a point of view of what we're learning, that's a better way to engage people and make them act, because we feel that otherwise people kind of turn off and they just don't want to hear about it, and they just feel like it's too much, they can't do anything. And so you can see here when looking at the British media, you've got Positive News magazine represented here. You have the BBC that regularly publish quite solutions-based stories. The Guardian does as well. And I mentioned already Incline, the media platform that I co-founded, so it's on there as well. So there are platforms out there that you can go check if you want to have these solutions stories coming into your inbox. So what we've been doing is last year we teamed up with, so Incline was running this series of workshops looking at covering the climate crisis from a solution lens. And so as part of this project, we did a workshop in the UK, a workshop in the Philippines, and a workshop in India. So you can check, if you go on the website of the Incline, the-incline.com, you can find more about all of these different things. And so today we're going to look at the one that we did in the UK. And so what we did is we gathered together journalists, activists, and scientists. We put all of them together in a Zoom room because the pandemic had just hit, so we couldn't do it in person. And we had them think about what are the barriers to not having more solution stories coming out in the news when it comes to the climate crisis. And so what we found through this workshop was that they found the key barriers was first, it was like the challenges of covering solutions, because often you have a long development timelines, high level policy, it's difficult to find fresh angle because it's such a massive topic. They also mentioned that there was a limitation of the journalism system. So very often in journalism, good news is associated with fluffy journalism. You know, it's like, oh, you're going to report about a cat being stuck in a tree and being saved. And that's not at all what this is about and what solutions journalism is about. And so actually there's an organization in the US called Solutions Journalism Network, and they're the one that are really championing this framework. And so you can find out more about what they call actual solutions journalism if you check their website. And very often journalists are also trained to cover crisis rather than solutions. So it's just not natural for them necessarily to cover the solution aspect. There's also the issue of clarity with the climate crisis. It's so big, it's so complex, there's so many nuances. And sometimes there's a bit of a fear from the journalism side that, you know, they might get it wrong and then it might get like backlash. And then there's also the academic system. So the fact that there's a limited time, it might be difficult to engage with the researchers. And the final point they raised was the commercial aspect. So it's just this preconceived idea that solution stories won't sell as much as the drama and, you know, the kind of like overly gloomy narrative that we can see sometimes. And so what we did then, once we had identified the barriers with a group of scientists, activists, and journalists, is that we started thinking of ways forward, how to break these barriers. And because we only had a limited amount of time, we couldn't do the 5 barriers, but we decided to do 1 and 2. And so what we found as a group is that what works really well in terms of the challenges of covering solutions when it comes to the climate crisis is to have a human narrative. And so that's something that can be really powerful. If you find your like key character and you can build your story around it, it is way more powerful than just giving people facts. They also found that fostering more creativity between scientists and journalists can be a great way to get these stories out. And also building and nurturing relationships between journalists, scientists, and activists, because sometimes they don't really speak the same language. You don't really have lots of engagement between them. And so there was a lot of talk about the importance of having science communicators to kind of like be the bridge between these different groups so that they talk to each other. And when it came to like the limitations of the journalism system itself, we kind of found that it was really important for people to develop long-term collaborations and also to introduce complex solution stories. And that is linked with having very strong fact-check process. Because we don't want solutions just for the sake of solutions. We want rigorous journalism. So we want stories that have been like checked and that are accurate. And then, of course, increasing training opportunities when it comes to solutions journalism and framing, having more of that in journalism school is a good way to do it. And then finally was, what was interesting as well is that what came out was that we needed to tap into different visual media. So with the climate crisis, what happens sometimes is that the issue is so big and it's such a complex and nuanced story again, that sometimes you don't really, the images you find are images linked to like catastrophe that are happening due to climate change or due to the climate crisis. And what we found is actually what can be quite powerful is work with illustrations rather than photographs, because then you can represent different things that you may not be able to capture or infographics, or like this type of like more bringing more an artistic side of it almost. And so again, working with artists and not just journalists or photographers can be another way to bring the climate crisis to the forefront in a different way. And so here I just wanted to put like a few resources, so a few websites you can check out if you want more stories that are about the climate crisis specifically, or just more positive stories. There's the Constructive Journalism Project, the Constructive Institute. I've already mentioned the Solutions Journalism Network. Climate Visuals and Climate Outreach, great organization based here in Oxford, which is where Conservation Optimism is also based. So I would encourage everyone to check out. And then there's like a few media outlets that you can check. And one great resource is, if you ever want to find solution stories when it comes to like the climate crisis or biodiversity crisis, is called the Solution Story Tracker. And so if you go on the Solutions Journalism Network website, then you're able to search. They have a database where people submit their journalism stories. And so it's a great way to find what might be working in different parts of the world. It's a great way to find a specific story about a specific species. So for example, if you go on there and you type penguin, you'll find a story I wrote. So there's lots of things on there that can be interesting to check when you need specific references or resources. So at this point, I just wanted to check if there was any questions, though I can't see the chat. So let me just see if maybe if I exit this just for a second. I still can't see the chat, so someone will have to tell me. if anyone has any question, then please feel free to just unmute yourself. We'll take one or two at this point, and then at the end of the presentation, there'll be more opportunities for questions.
Julia, we don't have any questions just yet, but we have a few comments from previously. But if there are questions, I'll shout.
Cool. Yeah, I don't know why I can't see them.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Giga. I'm from Slovenia. So just a quick question. Do you think that the framing of the extent of the crisis is making the situation even worse in the mind of the people, and which potentially makes them act less? Like, does it make sense?
Yeah, you mean the fact that we have so many negative stories?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that is like, it's the end of the world. It's over. It's apocalypse. Nothing you can do. Because do you think that is a big influence in people's perception on their action towards creating solutions?
I mean, I think there's definitely this kind of like feeling that then you reach that point where if everything you see is just negative stories, it's hard to then, be in a mindset where you think that things can get better. So I think there's definitely an issue with that. And as well, if you're the one writing stories, if you're a journalist and you see that everyone else is covering it that way, then it kind of becomes the norm. But what we've often found is that if you do bring in the more solutions-based angle, you do get a more positive response from people. People feel more empowered. People are then feeling more optimistic, basically, like giving them a bit of hope that things can change. So that's one way that we found is working quite well. But again, everyone is different. So some people get very motivated by dramatic doom and gloom messaging, and sometimes people need that kind of electroshock. They need to see like the okay, I get it, it's really bad, we need to do something. So again, I can't generalize and say we need to only have positive framing, but I think it's good to have a bit of a balance. So to just make sure that we don't only have the doom and gloom narrative, but to make sure that we also have the stories of what's working covered. So it's all about a balance. Does that answer your question?
Yes, very much so. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Julia, just speaking on balance, we have a question in the chat.
Yes.
Courtney asks, I'm curious about the ratio of bad news to good news for motivating people. If we had 100% of good news stories, it wouldn't motivate people to act. Same, obviously, for bad news. Have you found a ratio that works best? That's
a really interesting question. And I wish we had like some kind of research done on this. At this stage, we don't have any data on this. I know there's been scientific paper kind of looking at different framing. I know that there is one that looked at what makes people act, and again, they kind of ended up saying it was a balance of you needed a bit of both, but there was no clear ratio. So I don't have that data, but if you ever find it, I'd be curious to know, because I think that'd be fascinating. Okay, I'm gonna move on to the next part of the presentation, and again, we'll have more time for questions at various points. So just wanted to give you a little exercise, though again, I can't see the chat, but I'll look at it in the end. Just when you're thinking about your own activism or your own work, or your own communication, when you're talking about your family or friends about the biodiversity and climate crisis, which angle could you pick to pitch a research project to a journalist? What would be the one topic or the one thing that you'd really like to kind of like people to know about? What would be your key message? So I can't see your answers, but feel free to put them in the chat, and I will see them whenever I stop sharing the screen. But it'll be interesting to see what all of you kind of like work on, and what are the things that are important in your mind and that priority. So looking forward to be able to seeing the chat again. Oh, actually, wait, I think I might have found the chat. Ooh, I have found the chat. Okay, great. So if you want to put it on the chat, now I'll be able to see it. But in the meantime, we are now going to move on to looking at the positive communication toolkit. And so I'm going to pass on to Munib for that part.
Great. Thank you so much for this, Julia. I'll just, as we speak about the toolkit, I'm just going to drop in the chat the link to the toolkit as well. So, if people want to have a look at that link, or once we have spoken, maybe later in your free time, do visit that link, because what we speak on for the next about 20 or so minutes will is explained more in depth on the website. So let me start off by saying, I'm not really an expert at all when it comes to communications. I'm more, I've just learned or been trying to learn how to communicate better and more effectively, and definitely more positively. And that's where I think this toolkit really helped me personally. I think it's about a year and a half ago when I sat through a workshop about this toolkit, and I found it really tried to explain very basic concepts of communications that have really helped me communicate better, and I hope to share a bit with everyone today. So Julia, can you go to the next slide, please? So yeah, just to start off, and I think this is a link to the question Zika asked, right? Like, everything that we communicate is to do with the way we frame it. And just to read verbatim a little bit from the slide, what really is framing, right? Frames are related bits of information stored in memory. They're mental structures. These mental structures can be engaged by sometimes a single word, or a phrase, or an image, for instance, as long as it carries a clear set of associations and implies a way of viewing the world. For instance, an image of a peacock might remind me of my country, because the peacock is the national animal of India, for instance. It might symbolize something else for somebody else. A particular word might mean something to someone. So yeah, there's different frames with which we view this world. And what's very important to try and understand, though it's extremely hard, is to try and understand what's already in people's minds, because what's in their head will matter. So the question to ask is, what story or frame does your communication engage and reinforce? And just to give you an example of framing and its importance, we'll just look at the little cartoon on the left of the screen, where there's two sort of framings of a similar scenario. And the question really is, which one of these two is more motivating? So on the extreme left, we have, sort of not so happy looking koala. And, the message reads, due to devastating bushfires that have destroyed much of Australia's natural reserves, koalas are now considered functionally extinct. So it's quite a doom and gloom, sort of sad, almost hopeless narrative, right? Whereas on the right, a similar scenario is written from a different framing. Koalas have been hard hit by the Australian bushfires, so they're not shying away from the reality. But these conservationists are working to come up with a plan for how to help save them. So it sort of gives you a bit more of a positive spin, a bit more optimism to a very grave reality nonetheless. So framing really does matter. Next slide, please, Julia. I see there's a lot of chat coming in. If I miss, if there's questions that I miss, we can take them. But yeah, do stop me if you see the chat, Julia, and if there's something particularly pertinent.
Will do.
Awesome. Yeah, moving on. So yes, I hope I've sort of made a pitch for the importance of framing, and all of that can be a bit daunting, especially when you're a new person in the field of communication, or even if you work in the field of communication for a long time. How do we get that framing right? Because it's just so tricky. I mean, there's this rule of 3 that sort of really helps, and it's something that you perhaps should ask before even considering starting on doing a piece of communication, be it an article or whatnot, and just really asking yourself 3 things. So what is the objective of doing a piece of communication? What do you want to achieve from it? Who is the audience, right? Who are you trying to communicate to? And what is the outcome that you want? Trying to just think about these 3 points inevitably might help us, sort of have better messages out there, and hopefully more effective messages. Next slide, please. And though this becomes a bit tricky, after sort of thinking about these 3 points, acknowledging that framing matters, taking one step even deeper, and acknowledging and realizing that values and beliefs of people are very important. And again, I acknowledge it's very tricky to know who values what and what beliefs are useful in some circumstances. But then there are some learnings, some generalized learnings that we can take away from this. As the slide says, every message will engage values and beliefs to some extent, some more than others. Beliefs and values are important as they help determine how your message resonates with people, and in turn, how well it motivates them. So just to give you an example of a belief that is perhaps not so helpful is one of, the biodiversity crisis or the climate crisis is just too large. It's something that we cannot overturn, cannot fight, or cannot do anything about. While climate change is very daunting, just having that belief of hopelessness perhaps is not the most useful belief to have. However, acknowledging the graveness of the situation, but saying even though climate change and biodiversity crisis poses such a big problem to us, there are slivers of hope and learnings, even within failures, all across the globe that we can come together and do something, something positive about. So just these subtle changes and subtle differences in beliefs sometimes might be more effective than other times. On the left, I won't go through all of them, but again, you can take some time when you look at the positive toolkit online. There are some sort of values that have seemed to have positive impacts when it comes to messages or action to do with the environment at large. Things like equality, having equal opportunity for all is perhaps a good value to have, when we're working towards a better world for people and the environment. Similarly, things like social justice, love and loyalty. So yeah, just a plug to say, when we're thinking of messages, within the frame that we're trying to make these messages, values and beliefs matter. Next slide, Julia. So just before I hand over to Julia again, just a quick question for everybody to ponder. And yeah, as I say again, sometimes it's very hard to really know what beliefs and values are, but just to sort of think together or type together in the chat anyways, a short exercise, which values do you usually use in your messages? And messages can be in any form, written, oral, in any form really. Would you like to switch to other values instead? If so, which which ones would they be, for instance? So yeah, feel free to type away in the chat. I see there's a lot in the chat. I guess that's from.
So far, there's been like no specific questions, but people have been sharing what they're communicating about, what they're passionate about.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah.
But again, I just want to repeat as well, feel free to put things in the chat in different languages if English is not your first language. That's totally fine. And yeah, oh, someone just put a few values, Munib.
I see. Oh yeah, we have some answers coming in. Value of ecological services resonates pretty broadly. Completely agree. Yes. Environmental protection. I would like to switch to more personal values. Interesting. So yeah, sort of a more human, more personal connect. Sometimes, just helps make the message clearer, more connected. Ecological and social resilience, definitely quite an important value. Quite a loaded, quite a big value as well. Then we have equity, inclusion, positivity. Definitely equity, justice as in fairness, exactly. So as we can see, with all the answers coming in, there are so many different positive values that we can really work towards and work with. I don't want to take too much time. I see there's lots of lovely answers coming in, but yeah, please keep them coming in, and we can maybe discuss them more in depth later. So yeah. Next.
Yeah, thank you, Munib. Yeah, it's great to see what values are resonating with different people. I know that there's a lot of social justice and diversity inclusion coming in, very important values.
Exactly.
So I'll get back now to the toolkit, and I'm going to tell you about a few communication traps. So if you go online and check the full toolkit, you'll see that we have 8 traps in total. And again, I want to say that we worked on this toolkit with Framing Matters. We had Ralph Underhill, who was a consultant on this project, doing a lot of these traps. And so you can see all of the traps on the toolkit, and you can also find lots of reference to other work he's been doing around framing. So there's quite a lot of interesting resources in there. But we've decided to just keep it down to like a few here, because otherwise it would be going on for quite a while. So the first trap that I wanted to talk about is the parrot trap. And the nice thing here is that each trap is associated with an animal, which makes it easier to remember. And so the parrot trap is, well, what do parrots do? They're known to repeat things. And so the idea here is that you don't want to just repeat back what everyone says or what someone says. So for example, you don't want to say the Green Revolution will mean that people will lose their job. Will not lose their job, because then you're just reinforcing the idea. Even if you're saying a negative, people will still hear it in their mind. They'll still be like, oh, so there is a risk of losing jobs. And so instead you might want to say the Green Revolution will create jobs, and then you're completely turning it on its head, and then you have that positive idea from the start in people's head. So one thing that can be quite useful with this specific trap is to make a parrot list for your office and stick it on the wall, or use it weekly in team meetings. I mean, obviously with COVID, we're not necessarily in the office, but if you have a Slack platform, or like Trello or whatever other platform you use, you can have that with your team. And so you can highlight the parrot traps that you've seen being used in the media or on social media to kind of be aware of them and be a bit careful with how you're using them. Another trap that is quite relevant for, in conservation is the shark trap. And so this is the contaminated and contested language trap. So the idea here is avoid playing into negative associations. So again, for a lot of people, since Jaws came out, then shark became associated with like, oh my God, terrifying animal, they will kill you. So there are other words or kind of like phrases that we use in conservation or in the environmental sector that can have a bit of that as well. So for example, you might not want to say human-wildlife conflict. The thing that comes in mind is conflict straight away. It's like, okay, so interaction between human and wildlife are always negative. Instead, you might want to just say interactions between people and wildlife. Then, that's the neutral term. Or if you want to highlight the positive, the positive interactions, then you might say human-wildlife coexistence. But if you use human-wildlife conflict, just be aware that, straight away you're putting people in a bit of a frame, a mind frame. And so an action on this one is a list of contaminated terms and just like remember what they are and try to ditch them whenever you can. So when you're using a contested framing, you really want to question whether you can win the fight for it or if it's just better to use another term. Because sometimes if you plant the idea, it's really hard to then get rid of it later. So sometimes it's just easier to decide to use another term from the start. Another threat that we've got in the toolkit is the cobra. And this is the threat heavy trap. And that's something that we do a lot of work to try to balance with conservation optimism. So that's very much balancing threats with positives in action. And again, that linked to our introduction when we talked about doom and gloom narrative and how it often makes people kind of like turn off and just they decide not to engage. So an example here is rather than saying chinstrap penguin populations are plummeting due to climate change and just leave it at that, you know, that's kind of like your mic drop, that's the end of the story. Instead, you might want to try saying, while the charismatic and much loved chinstraps are declining rapidly with climate change, in Zawodowski, their largest colony has survived the 2016 volcanic eruptions, showing their ability to adapt if we help them to do so. So here again, you're giving the challenge, you're talking about the situation and you know it is declining due to climate change, but you're bringing in a bit of that positive by saying, but they've been known to adapt in other places, and you're kind of bringing as well that comparison. And I think that's something that is always quite important is like, what can we learn from a conservation project or an environmental project happening in a different place? Is there anything that we can scale or replicate or learn from? I think these are really important. And so the action for this one is to make a list or a file of conservation successes you can draw on. And of course, Conservation Optimism is a great resource for you to do that. If you follow us on social media, on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, we post regular blogs about positive success stories from the conservation sector. And also every Monday, we post a blog that is 7 stories of optimism this week. So every week you get a dose of 7 stories. So if you ever need any, it's a great place to check for that. We also have a trap called the vampire bat trap. And again, here you can see it's like the typecasting trap. Vampire bat is straight away in your head, this idea of something that's going to come and just, drink your blood and not going to be, nice. And sometimes we do that without really realizing. I think this one is really important because I think that's something that so often is very unconscious. So being a bit more conscious about it is important. The example that you can see here is, I don't know if you remember, but a few years ago, there was this headline everywhere in the media talking about the fact that a rhino poacher had been trampled by an elephant and then eaten by lions. And the comments and like the shares were just, I thought they were awful. Like at the end of the day, someone died. Like this person had a family, like it's an actual person, an actual human being. So there's no like poetic karma-like justice in an accident like that. And this kind of a headline, just forget that there is a man with family behind the poacher title. It's just giving people this kind of box and then portraying them as one thing. And usually with poachers, it's very often portraying them as evil people, as people who just do horrible things and should be punished, without taking into account the fact that very often there are livelihood issues coming into it, there are economical issues. It's much more complex than just this kind of like typecast character. So the action for this trap is to be a bit careful when you're having like villains and victim roles within your communication or your messages, unless you have a clear purpose in mind that suits the roles, and just really question, just question the way you're portraying different characters, different types of people, because that can be really detrimental. Just before taking questions, I wanted to add on this one as well. We've got another trap that is kind of like linked to this one that you can find in the toolkit. But another thing as well that happens when you're typecasting is that then you can end up focusing on like a tiny aspect of the problem. And actually, if you take the ivory poaching, for example, a lot of time people focus on poachers, but then that kind of like make it, by focusing on the poacher side, then we're not talking about the end, which is actually people buying ivory and how we can change behavior from that side. So sometimes it's important when we think about these roles, kind of see the bigger picture as well. So now, again, here we're going to have a short break for questions. Happy to take one or two if you have any. And then Sophia will come in and tell us about Creative Commons. I see that people have been asking about websites. Munib has answered that. Yeah, anyone has a question that you want to unmute yourself or ask on video or put in the chat, then please feel free to do so. Otherwise we'll move on to Creative Commons. Okay. I think passing on to you, Sophia.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to tell you about some of the things that we have done as Conservation Optimism to engage in creative communications. And we kind of titled this, it was just sort of trying to think about how we could do communications in ways that were more artistic. So as Julia was saying in some of the earlier slides, just trying to have these other kind of maybe visual or audio or other kind of creative forms of communication that we might not usually think of. So these are just some of the collaborations that we've done and some of the things that you might actually want to think about getting involved with as well. So one thing that we do is that we collaborate with artists. So here, that mural that you see was a collaboration that we did with artist Louis Massai at the Zoological Society of London. So within the zoo, if any of you have ever been to the zoo in London, you walk around and you can see these murals of endangered animals. So we worked with him to create those. And then also we, these artists called Under the Skin, who create, they make these prints where if you shine UV light on them, and they're also of endangered animals, but if you shine UV light on them, then it shows the skeleton of the animal. And so they were kind enough to donate some of their works for our film festival. And generally, yeah, so also Julia made some resources to communicate to children about sort of animals and conservation stories. And then also a collaboration here with wildlife illustrator Rachel Hudson. So if we could go to the next one. So the other thing that Julia and I have done is that we created the Good Natured podcast. And you can see there a very flattering photo of us recording during the pandemic, because we were originally supposed to be recording in a studio, but as it turns out, if you put yourself under a blanket, you can get quite good audio quality because it cuts down on reflection and stuff like that. So what we did is that we came up with the idea for this podcast where we interview people in conservation, and we define a conservationist as someone who cares about conservation issues and tries to do something about them. And so we've interviewed people from all kinds of professions. We interviewed a climate psychologist who works on eco-anxiety. We've also interviewed conservation scientists. So for example, Carl Jones, who has actually done some amazing work restoring endangered species in Mauritius. And we also talked to, for example, a theatre director who has made plays or like one-man shows about endangered species as well. And so our idea there is to just kind of like amplify our idea of what it can be to be a conservationist. And then also selfishly, but also I'm happy for everybody who can listen to the podcast, is like just having these amazing conversations with completely fascinating people who integrate conservation into their lives in different ways. And sometimes we can take inspiration from the challenges that they've faced, but also the successes that they've had. And yeah, just, I mean, I recommend listening to it if you have a minute and you enjoy podcasts. And then, can I have the next slide? So something that I'd been involved in for a few years was doing stop motion animations. And I think that it can be a way of making films that is very accessible, because actually it's just kind of taking a bunch of photos. It does take time, but it's taking a bunch of photos and then kind of like making them into a film. And I did a workshop on that at the first Conservation Optimism Summit, when we had a conference where it was like, you know, lots of people could come, and we had all of these kind of interactive workshops. And so that is one way to make a film about conservation. But there are obviously a lot of different ways, and we're hopefully going to get some resources with suggestions about conservation animations up soon. But so the other thing that Julia and I do is that we host a film festival, and in it we like to feature stories of conservation optimism and hope. And so, you know, the first year that we did it, we were kind of like, okay, we want to make a short film festival, so any kind of films 5 minutes under, and then we ended up getting like over 300 submissions from all over the world, and it was a really wonderful event. We hosted it at the Oxford Museum of Natural History, and we had animations, we had stories of local conservation, we had films also made by children, which were really cute and amazing. And actually, the film festival is now open for submissions again. So that this is going to be our 3rd year doing the film festival. And yeah, if you have any short films that relate to themes of conservation optimism, please send them in. Or if you know of any really amazing filmmakers, you know, then please send them our way as well. And usually when we do the film festival, we are also collaborating with artists. So as you could see before, in order to make it a kind of bigger event where we can celebrate these creative ways of communicating about conservation. So, does anybody have any questions?
There has been a few questions put in the chat.
Seems like
Sophia,
none
so
now. Looking through the chat.
There's been a few questions about communication specifically with kids. So I don't know if you want to talk about that, or if you want me to talk about that, or we can both talk about it.
Yeah, so I think that Julia has done probably more work on that within Conservation Optimism. So if you want to take that question, please do.
Yes. So what we found works really well with kids specifically, or at least the way we've approached it, because we haven't necessarily done a full assessment of our resources, so it's hard to know. But we usually go the very visual route. So what we've done is creating very visual posters. I know Muniba has shared the link to our Kids Corner. So we kind of created these very visual posters showcasing where a species would live. And then we had a story of optimism. You know, we had a fun fact to make it like nice and engaging for kids. And what we've done as well is we made animated videos with the Museum of Natural History here in Oxford. And we made this animated video by using Canva, which is a free tool that you can use online. It's, you know, it doesn't require any kind of like, it's not like Adobe, you know, you don't need specific skills to be able to use it. It's really user-friendly. And we found that these like mini animated videos work quite nicely on kids because, you know, they're short, but then it's, again, very visual. It changes every couple of seconds, so it keeps you engaged. So that's the different things that we've been doing. And then in terms of outreach, so in-person communication, which, I mean, for most of us at the moment is not happening. But whenever we can do that, again, one thing that is always really popular and that Sophia mentioned is we've been doing stop motion animation workshops. So there's like an app that you can get on your phone. And then again, it's free. And then what you do is we have like lots of Legos. And I mean, I can tell you, you don't want to put the Legos on the table before you're ready because kids will come to you. And then what we do is they create like a little conservation scene. So we had like Legos of different animals and people. And then they take a photo and they move it slightly and they take another photo. And then at the end, it looks like, you know, it's animated. So that's another thing that we found. So I think the key takeaways is to make it very visual or make it very interactive, particularly if you're targeting younger kids. I think teenagers are quite a different audience. So yeah, but we also have resources for young people that we've developed that are more for older kids and kind of like young adults as well.
Yeah, I think I would agree with everything that you said, Julia. I think just trying to keep it kind of as interactive and visual as possible is really important in communicating with younger kids. I saw a question come up in the chat about what is the most effective way to share information, e.g. data from scientific papers when you communicate about environmental issues, especially to non-scientific audiences. This is something that I think we've thought about a lot within Conservation Optimism, and I have also thought about a lot being kind of within academia as my day job and doing conservation research, I would say that there are a lot of ways that can be very effective ways to communicate. It really depends on what your strongest communication tool is and like what your strongest interests are. And so I think that it's possible to make, for example, a really engaging stop motion animation that people will relate to. I think it's also possible to make a podcast. I think it's also possible to write a blog post, have a conversation with your friends over dinner, right? I mean, it's sort of about the opportunities that present themselves, and then sort of within that, how you choose to explain these issues to people who are non-scientists. And I think that there are a lot of things within the positive communication toolkit that can be really helpful in terms of looking at those traps, and they can apply to any kind of communication again. So I think that if you're really passionate about making a film, take a look at those traps, you know, as you're writing your script or designing it. It can also help you with everyday conversations or writing a blog post, even an academic paper. I know it can be really, really useful for just in terms of considering language.
Can I just add very quickly to that, if I may? And just, yeah, one thing that I mean, I'm guilty of myself many, many times, but I feel like might be useful to consider is, you know, sometimes when we know a certain topic as a researcher, there's a lot of jargon that we use. And certain things, you know, it's easy to know, oh, this is definitely jargon, but trying not to assume that everybody knows every word that you're saying sometimes can be useful. You know, just trying to ask yourself, you know, when I say, you know, something like climate change, even though we might understand that in and out, does everybody understand climate change, or the audience that I'm talking to, do they really understand the words I'm using? I think, yeah, that sometimes goes quite a long way. So not to assume that we know, the people that we're speaking to know every word or, you know, communication, you know, a little thing that we're talking about. Yeah, just that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I wanted to jump in as well. There was a question that kind of came up a while ago that I found in the chat, so I wanted to answer it as well. Someone was pointing out that it can be quite tricky to create communication messages because going to nature is actually pricey and requires, you know, kind of like this funds to be able to access it. And I think that's quite interesting because at the moment we're having a project with teenagers, and what we're trying to do is to make them realize that there's a lot in their own backyard. And, you know, even if you're in a city, that you have these parks, or sometimes you have like a garden, or there might be these like plants that you just don't really pay attention to, but usually, you know, they exist, they're there. Or even just if you have like a window, you can see birds or you can see insects. So I think it doesn't necessarily have to be that dichotomy of to access nature. You need to have like, I think it's important to bring back the urban nature as well. And so that's something that we're trying to do, particularly with young people, to showcase that everyone can get that connection with nature, even if it's not a pristine nature, or, you know, it's not nature that we see in a documentary. But there's so much around all of us. And then another point on that as well is the miracle of technology. You know, for us with the podcast, we've been talking to so many people who are in really cool places doing awesome work. We didn't go there, you know, we didn't spend any money. We just used the internet and you know, had them on Skype or on different platforms to be able to talk to them, and then bringing these stories to life. The same goes with our Kids Corner. You know, it's kind of like based on like doing a bit of research, talking to specific people, and then packaging it in a way that was very visual for kids to interact with. So I think it is true that depending on, you know, what you want to like work on, sometimes you do need to get there and it is expensive, but I think there are also lots of ways around that. I don't know if Sophia, Munib, you had anything to add. I can see that someone has a raised hand as well, so tell me if you have anything to add, and then we can have Zige talking.
Yes, I just have one question. I'm currently working in the field of motorsport, which is kind of not a very friendly place to be talking about environmental issues, but I think it's still important. So so my question is, how, like, what tips or suggestion would you have to, from a organizational point of view, to have a impactful message to the audience, which is not very aware or considerate about the topic. So like one from the point of view as an organization who is not putting a lot of effort, but kind of wants to start increasing it. And also, and the second part from the point of the audience who is not putting environment as a priority, and that so that message would be fruitful, I guess.
That's a really good question. Sophia, Munib, did you want to like take that one? Do you want me to answer first?
I wanted to just quickly share some thoughts about, I don't know if this is an answer, but just my quick thought on it. I mean, I personally believe sometimes, the best way to tell somebody something or a group is by actually, being the example rather than just sort of, saying things. So like, for instance, if, I was an organization or whatever, an NGO or a student union or whatnot, and if I truly believed in environmental causes, just doing our bit, and leading by example, for instance, be it being conscious of, the food we get for events, where does it come from? Is it as responsibly sourced and environmentally friendly sourced as possible? For instance, what do we do with the rubbish after we organize an event? Sort of being the example first, and then sort of using that to communicate to people. I find that's quite effective. So, sort of turning the lens on oneself, both personally and organizationally, and then sort of using that as an example. If that's possible, I think that's one of the strongest ways to be an effective communicator. But yeah, just my thoughts, Sophia.
Yeah. I think I would add to that, just saying that acknowledging that I think you have an amazing opportunity, right? Because you are in a field where maybe not a lot of people consider themselves conservationists. And so, for example, as a conservation scientist, it's like blah, 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 like everyone's saying the same thing to some extent, And so it's like maybe the impact that you can have as an individual is not as huge. And I don't know that much about your field, I mean, you are going to be so much more aware of what the challenges are, what the opportunities are within it. So I can't give you sort of specific suggestions, but I guess it would just be sort of like Munib was saying, maybe really looking at your field and being like, I think this is a really big problem. I think that maybe this is something that I could help to address. I think that maybe here is a solution that I can see, and so maybe sort of starting to think through that and implementing it yourself, seeing does it work, but then also maybe thinking about talking to your networks within your field and just letting them know about what you're doing and seeing, whether there are other people who maybe have similar priorities, but haven't had the time or the energy to think through what it is that they could do or the change that could be made maybe to make things better.
Thank you very much. Just one quick follow-up, because especially in the field that I'm working in, the motorsport, there is a very fast, like when organizations or many organizations, when they're communicating about it, there is the audience tends to get to that greenwashing really fast. So there is a lot of hesitance from the organizations to actually to promote what they're doing, because the audience, the public perception is more negative. So it's kind of, they can get attacked very fast. So that's kind of sorry, I don't know if you have any suggestions on how to help them or how to avoid that, maybe. But
yeah,
thank you very much.
I mean, that's a very good point. I think like greenwashing is such like a big topic, and people, as you said, people are a bit suspicious. One thing that I would add that has not maybe been said in these terms yet is I think finding the human story and how it connects to like your local community is also a good way to go about it. And that can be through finding your ambassadors. So I'll give you a practical example. In my previous job when I was at Chester Zoo, they started this project around sustainable palm oil. And so they wanted to get restaurants on board to turn Chester Zoo into becoming the first sustainable palm oil city in the world. And so their goal was that they needed to have like X amount of restaurants on board. They needed to have X schools. They had like these kind of targets. And what made the change, what really started getting the project going, is they found one ambassador. Like there was one restaurant that went through the process, was very keen, did it, and then, you know, got a little badge at the end, at the entrance of the restaurant saying, I'm a palm oil, sustainable palm oil restaurant. And then once people could see someone had done it from their own community of people working in the food industry, it really snowballed, and they made it. You know, they turned Chester into the first sustainable palm oil city, which was really exciting. But I think it's really like having that ambassador at the beginning was really important, because then that person is the one that talked to other people who had restaurants being like, no, I swear it's doable. You know, you need to go through like your list of suppliers and you'll have to make changes, but I've done it and I can tell you how to do it. And I think that can be really powerful if you have, but again, with greenwashing, you know, it needs to be like a genuine story, someone that can really be authentic about it. But that would be my advice.
Perfect. Thank you very much to all of you for
Yeah.
the answers. Thank you very much.
I think
one last thing that I would add, perhaps.
Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say that I think one thing that I might add, just in terms of greenwashing, because greenwashing obviously is a problem. And I think that usually what happens is that, I mean, you know, the reason that people think of greenwashing is like essentially people saying that they're doing things in order to get a good image, but then maybe not actually doing them, or like not really having that intention. And so I think that one way to counter that is to set goals for yourself, some kind of like Julia was talking about, setting clear goals for yourself and then measuring in what ways you are meeting those goals, right? And so you create targets and then you monitor your progress and then you communicate that. Because I do think that having sort of evidence or like ways that you can demonstrate that the change that you have made, you know, is all you can do essentially. And then if somebody decides that they don't think it's genuine enough or they don't think it's enough, then maybe you can have a conversation about that, but at least you kind of have documented what you intended to do and what you did.
Thank you.
I just wanted to check. I can see that we have one more question in the chat about preaching to the converted. What's the feeling in the room? Are people happy for us to answer that one question, or do you want to move on to like the break and then the exercise part? What's the consensus? If there's no preference, I will assume that we can answer the question. Okay. Yeah. Cool. The question was, worry that sometimes our messaging ends up focusing on preaching to the converted. How do we talk to those who disagree with us, example, climate change deniers, in a way that can effectively create change in opinions and also keep an ethos of respect, even in disagreement? And that person said that can often happen with families too, which is very true. Do you guys want to answer that one first?
Yeah. I have had experience with this. And I think that, you know, there's not necessarily an answer in every situation. I think it's so dynamic, and particularly kind of within families. Again, it's the sort of thing with families and friends and all that kind of thing. It's like you have a special opportunity because you are a sort of trusted messenger, you know, you're like within that group, right? Like in some ways you might be able to access those people or change their minds in ways that other people couldn't. At the same time, it's like sometimes you can feel like you've become the kind of like the annoying eco warrior, like within the family or whatever, you know? And so I don't know, like within each situation, I think it's kind of like dynamic in terms of what you decide to bring up. I think that again, the positive communication toolkit, I know I keep saying it, but I think that those traps are really useful to consider. And sometimes they can help you to frame your messages, you know, in ways of like not, you know, for example, if somebody starts being like, oh, you know, climate change isn't real, you know, rather than being like, climate change is not real. Okay, that's a terrible example, right? But in terms of like, of sort of how you can frame your messages, and maybe you can give, or, you know, people saying, oh, there's nothing we can do about climate change, then you can be like, oh, actually, here are some examples of things that can be done about climate change and that are being done about climate change. So yeah, I mean, take a look at that again. And then I think the only other thing that I would say is, yeah, it's so hard to keep that balance and that sort of like respect and everything like that. But you know, I think, yeah, ultimately just trying to get your message across as effectively as you can. One thing that I found quite useful is questions. And so that's just like as a personal thing, not necessarily as a CO thing, but in terms of just trying to understand where they're coming from and trying to understand like what it is that they have read, what it is that they've come across, like how did they come to shape these views. And sometimes in asking those questions and in genuinely listening, you can end up having conversations that are a lot more powerful because you kind of also understand more where they're coming from, as opposed to maybe making the assumptions that we can all be trapped into making. I don't know if Julia or Munibi.
I had one very small point to add to that. I mean, I think Sophia sort of covered most of the thing. I mean, I was just listening to that because I definitely have family members / friends that I, sometimes I'm like, oh, I want to convince you, but, I feel like I always fall short. But in that, I think there's a small learning that I would like to share. I think sometimes personally, I always look at things as like black and white, and that's not useful, right? Like, for instance, we think of, people, like there's a group of people who are all behind climate change and, they know that it's a reality and they need to change it. And then there's climate deniers. And I think when we talk to the climate deniers, for instance, right, like we want to bring them all to the other side. And sometimes, no, not even sometimes, I guess often that will never happen immediately. So realizing that these changes are a spectrum, there are one step, small step at a time. And I think those are very, very useful victories to have. Like, perhaps the worst is when you can't even have a conversation, let's say, with a climate denier, right? Having even a conversation where, you're respectful and, talk about facts, and then, they realize a little bit, even though they might not jump the spectrum from the denier to the acceptance stage, is still useful. So sort of, thinking of it as a step-by-step journey rather than just like this one either or side is sometimes quite useful. But yeah, and everything else that Sophia said really hit the nail on the head.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's all about, again, bringing these personal stories and personal narrative. How is it affecting people that they might know? But one thing that I would add as well, especially when people are very far on the spectrum on one end or the other, I think sometimes it can be about picking your battles as well. Like, if you start engaging and you see that you're just like hitting a wall, there's a question of, how much time and energy do you want to try convincing someone that ultimately won't change their mind. So I feel like it can be hard to do, but I think sometimes picking your battle and just being like, what, let's just agree to disagree and not go into like a full-on hour argument that won't resolve anything sometimes can be great good as well. Okay, so I think that we should now take a short break. And then what we can do is we can do the breakout rooms. We have like little exercise for you. So the first one is that you'll be put in breakout rooms. You'll have a Conservation Optimism person with you to facilitate. And you'll be talking about your audience. Who is it that you're trying to reach with your message? Who is it that you want to talk to and why? And then the second part will be about, now that you've heard about all the different types of creative comms that exist, what do you think is the best format to reach them? Is it a blog? Is it a podcast? Is it a video? Is it an animated, a slow motion animation? So let's all go on a break. Let's say, so it's 5:12 here. Well, I guess everyone is in a different time zone though. If we all come back in like 3 minutes. So if you want to like go to the bathroom, grab a tea, and then we will divide everyone in breakout rooms. So yeah, feel free to just mute, turn your video off, and when you're back, we'll put everyone in breakout rooms.
Yeah, and just quick. Yeah, just quickly to say, I am gonna have to head off now because I'm a week away from submitting my PhD. But yeah, if anyone wants to get in touch with me with any further questions, feel free to do so over email or let Julia know. Bye.
Perfect. Bye, Sophia. For the Conservation Optimism team facilitators, if you're here, can you just please make sure that you put your name on Zoom as your name and then Conservation Optimism so that people in your group know that you're a facilitator. Hi, everyone. Okay, we are going to try to now send you into 5 different breakout rooms. I'm going to share now in the chat a link to Padlet, and that will allow you to basically take notes within your group. So you'll see it's kind of like a mural where you will see there's like breakout room 1, breakout room 2, and you have like a little plus under each of them. So you can add the notes for your breakout room and under each subheading. And so just a reminder, the goal for this one is to talk about your audience, who your primary audience might be, and you'll be in group with like various people, so you can talk about how different your audiences might be. And then just make sure to have one person filling it in Padlet. Actually, if the Conservation Optimism person in each room could fill it in, that would probably be easier. So I'm now going to try and send everyone to the breakout room, so we'll see how that goes. It'll take a few minutes, so bear with me. Okay, I'm going to try to assign them automatically because I think it's going to be easier. So if you're a Conservation Optimism person and you end up with multiple ones in the same room, then you can leave the room and I'll reassign you. Okay, so you should now all be seeing your room, so you should be able to join them. And I'll be able to like move you if needed. And you have the link to Padlet, so you can fill that in, and we'll meet again in like 10 minutes or so.
I went to 2, Julia, and Iona's already there. So.
Oh, okay. Can I put you in room 3 then? There's no Conservation Optimism person.
Hey guys, is everyone in this room, or I'm just trying to see if this is the main room? Hello, if you can hear me. Hi guys, can you hear me? Hello.
Hello? Hello? Oh. Hello?
Hi there, I just joined. Would it be possible to join a breakout room?
Hey everyone, I think we might all be back. I'm not fully sure. Let me see in gallery. Oh no, we're not all back. Okay, I've done something wrong clearly. There we go. Everyone should start trickling back. I just closed our room basically and not the rest. Okay, I think everyone is starting to trickle back. Hopefully you all had interesting conversations in your groups. Hey everyone, just waiting for a few more rooms to join us. I think it's taking a few seconds. Yeah, I can see everyone is starting to reappear. Well, that's really interesting looking at the Padlet and seeing the different audiences that people have identified. Lots of different audiences. It's interesting to see some are like very narrow, some are quite broad. I just wanted to kind of like check with you. I think it might be a better way of using the time that remains to answer more questions if you have them. It is quite tricky to do like the breakout rooms at that scale because we're quite a lot of people. The other activities that we were planning on doing was to do a breakout room again, but this time discussing the format of how you might want to talk to your specific audience. So if you can just use the raise your hand option to let me know, would you prefer having more time for questions now rather than doing the activity? If so, you can raise your hand. You can see one. Okay, and can you raise your hand if you want to do the activity? Can't really, I think there's
I think there is a technological bridge because I wanted to vote for the first one, but it took a while to find the little hand.
Oh, no worries. Actually, if you can just put it in the chat, then if it might be easier, if you prefer having questions or if you want to go into the breakout room, quickly drop a note in the chat so that I can see what's the kind of consensus. Questions, yeah, room, questions.
Could just do maybe a few more minutes of questions until people have no more questions.
That sounds like a good plan. I think there was one that we didn't get a chance to answer earlier. Let me just go back in the chat. Or if the person who had, oh yeah, I found it. So one of the questions we had from Carlos was, why does training programs organized? Wait, what's the question? I'm not sure. I think I don't think we can actually answer that question. The question was, why does training programs organized by conservation agencies remain open often to their affiliate? Why a majority of graduates are out there looking for opportunities to get exposure? Not necessarily something that I can answer, but if anyone else has any other questions, then please put them in the chat. Otherwise, it'd be great to hear if you were in the breakout room before, if someone from the breakout room one, yeah, did someone have a question?
Yes, I do.
Go ahead.
Unfortunately, I went out of the session because of my network. Sorry. I don't know, maybe probably the question have been answered before because I sent it in the Q&A. So since we are talking about communication, there's this notion normally about trying to create a balance between biodiversity, nature-based solutions to climate crisis. But most of the time, we do not find the right words to communicate this to communities right there at the local level to understand how can biodiversity conservation also be something that we can use to kind of offset the kind of effects that we get from climate change. So how can we create the nexus for communities to be able to understand this kind of messages? That was what I wanted to know. I'm Bintu from Sierra Leone, West Africa.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for your question. Munib, did you want to answer that one? I could see that you were making a move for the mic.
Kind of. I mean, it's such a lovely question, but also such a sort of big question. So I don't think I can sort of say that I have the answer to that as a whole. But I have some thoughts and suggestions that might sort of, be useful. I think two things I would like to say. One is really seeing the on-ground reality of the quote-unquote communities that we're talking about, right? Like, who are they? What means and methods do they communicate in? For instance, so I'm from India, as I said, and the community where I work up in the mountains. They're very oral in the way they sort of pass down messages. And when I mean by oral, it's not only about talking; it's about song and folklore and things like that. And it's more effective to sort of communicate sometimes through those means than, let's say, making a poster, which is something that we do a lot back home, with different communities. Many of them might look at that poster and just see it as a visual and nothing more, right? So sometimes, just finding the nuance of the method, which is something we spoke in our breakout room as well, really would matters, and I think that might help. The second point that I would like to say is a bit more sort of unrelated to the question directly, but more indirectly, is asking ourselves, like, is it just the communities that we want to talk to? Who are really the stakeholders in the larger picture? And, there might be people like corporations or governments, local governments or things like that, who are equally sort of important players in the whole climate, quote unquote, issue of a particular region that we're talking about. So even if communities did something, there's this larger systemic problem that we have to tackle. So just asking yourself, taking a step back, and again, something we spoke about in our breakout room, asking yourself, like, who are the stakeholders here, and are we engaging with as many as we can? Sometimes also helps us talk to the right people. So yeah, I don't know if that answered the question, but hopefully gave some food for thought.
Yeah, I can see that someone has raised their hand. Abigail, I don't know if I pronounced your name correctly. You have your hands raised.
I think I raised my hand a long time ago to say, so it's good. Thank you.
That happens. Let me just put back in gallery so I can see everyone. Was there any questions otherwise in the chat? I can see. Okay. I think if there's no question for now. Oh, wait. Let me just try to put that in a way that I can easily see if people are actually raising their hand. Yeah, one thing that could be interesting to discuss if people want to kind of like pull back on what was discussed in the breakout rooms is did you find that within the rooms you had quite like a homogeneous group of, like, your audience were fairly similar, or did people find that their audiences were very different and like quite niche in their own way? If like a representative from a room wanted to share the experience or the discussions that you've been having within the room.
I can go for room 1 first. So we had someone from, every person in that room was from a different country, which was quite exciting. And we had a real variety of people from media, like communications, already working in that area, to just wanting to find out more about it. And we had some really good ideas. We did talk a little bit about the formats that we'd want to communicate in. And we've had some really creative ideas that go from YouTube videos and drama and theatre, which was really exciting, but also just simple face-to-face communication, because it feels like it gives the person who's speaking confidence to actually go out and talk with these people. And yeah, we had a nice discussion about these potentially not alternative, but not so common means of communication instead of the normal, you know, writing and newspaper articles. So I thought it was quite a nice conversation.
Interesting. I mean, it's really interesting seeing on Padlet, like the different audiences that everyone kind of like defined. I was wondering if maybe, so you were, which breakout rooms were you in? Remember?
Sorry, I was in 1.
Number 1. Do we have someone who wants to kind of share what the discussion was in breakout room 2?
I was in room 2, but I'd love to see if we had a lovely discussion and everyone was chatting. So if anybody wants to jump in, I'm probably not going to be pronouncing your names well, but Bren, Leah, Crystal, you guys had some really lovely thoughts. So I don't know if you wanted to unmute and share them with us. Maybe I can. Okay, maybe I can do like a quick one, and just feel free to jump in. So yeah, we had quite a diverse group as well, much like Iona's, and a lot of different sort of topics and discussions. One thing that came out quite significantly from our group was having sort of the youth and young professionals as an audience is quite useful for multiple reasons. I mean, we kind of define them as, you know, people between the ages of 15 to 35. You know, because, you know, they're sort of the next generation. That's where, you know, they can do a lot more. Sometimes they know the urgency and the reality of the situation most, sort of they're in the middle ground, you know, of the situation. So that was one point that really sort of came out from our group. The other point, which I thought was very interesting, was sort of the audience, perhaps very important to engage with, is you know, not the sort of the converted that we kind of refer to previous to our breakout rooms, but like people who are in the middle ground, who kind of maybe see, oh, there is a problem, but they're not entirely convinced, you know, or they're a bit low on, let's say, awareness or knowledge about certain things. You know, those people, bringing them to the other side would be interesting. And then last, sort of a more general point, which I thought was interesting, was the point about the method being as important as the message sometimes, you know, the method with which you communicate to an audience, because yeah, different people, different audiences assimilate information differently. So that's
a very good point. Yeah. I was in room 3, but it'd be great if someone else wants to give a recap who was with me in room 3. I know we had like quite a range of different audiences. Does anyone want to share what we discussed in our group? Okay, otherwise I can give a summary. What we found in the breakout room 3, I would say, is that people had that sometimes you think that you don't have an audience, or, you know, you're just saying something like someone was mentioning, you know, oh, I mean, my audience, I guess, is only my families and classmates. And actually, that is a really good audience to start with, because it's a really well-defined niche audience. So then you can really like target your message. So that was something that kind of like came up. And then we had also a chat about for someone within the group, if please correct me if I'm wrong, or if you want to add to it. But we had someone who talked about the fact that through their work, they do a lot of communication to businesses and financial institutions. So they were saying, you know, their audience is kind of like their clients. It's kind of like merged into one concept. And then we also had thoughts about, you know, how do you, like, to what level do you go? So for example, someone was saying their audience was their community. So I kind of asked to clarify what level of community we were talking about. You know, was it like town, a country, a continent? So sometimes just defining your audience slightly in terms of these different scales and different levels can be quite useful. And then we also had someone who was working on a podcast, very exciting. And there we kind of had a discussion about the fact that in podcast, you kind of have an audience already that is defined by the fact that a lot of podcast listeners are younger people. So, you know, you probably are going to tap more into like the 18 to 35 years old bracket. And the person who was working on the podcast as well had like an interest in potentially looking more into eco-anxious young people. So again, like bringing it to that more narrow audience and making sure that the podcast then can be targeted. So that's the discussion we had in room 3. If I got anything wrong, or if anyone wants to add something, please feel free to jump in. Otherwise, if we have someone who can maybe give us like a quick summary of room 4, that would be great.
I don't know.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Pinto.
I don't know the room because at a point, like I said, I left the group sessions. So I came in late and I joined a group that something came up that was really interesting for me in the discussion because I came in late. I think somebody raised some sort of, I think, body paint for conservation. It's kind of new to me. And they shared a link wherein you can know more about that such kind of communication channel. But I think it was interesting and very new for me. So that's just what I wanted to add.
Yeah, I think Munib, you just reshared the link, isn't it? That sounds really interesting. Do we still have that person here? Maybe who can tell us a bit more about that specific project?
I see her here. I don't know what if she wants to chat and tell us a bit more about it.
Okay, otherwise, I guess we can go back to like the breakout room number 4, maybe. Have someone given a quick summary. Who was in Trisha? You were about to give us a summary, wasn't it?
Yeah, I was in breakout room 4. So yeah, we actually ran out of time while we were still discussing and talking about things. But it was nice. It was a nice group because there were a lot of diverse people again, as the other groups have been saying, but not just in terms of who their audience are, but also what the communication message was or what the sort of topic or the thing that they wanted to communicate. So we had some people who wanted to have a more general or a broader audience of just people in general on social media, and how would you connect with them and communicate with them and get them more connected to the environment. But we also had some people who were from Colombia and Costa Rica and a few other countries who wanted to their audience being as broad as diverse as even tourists, and wanting to communicate with tourists and connect them more to the biodiverse regions in the country, to I think forest communities, to talk about forest destruction. And there was also somebody in the group, Carlos, I think his name was, who was working with birding and bird awareness with students, and he was talking about how it is really effective that they use a lot of bird books and binoculars and pictures to get people excited about birds and more aware of the birds around them. So that was interesting.
Awesome. Thank you, Trisha. That sounds like you had a really interesting discussion. It's just really interesting seeing all the different things that kind of like come up. Do we have someone who can give us like a quick summary for the last room, the breakout room 5?
Hello, I can give a brief overview of our conversation in breakout room 5. We had a really nice conversation that I suppose revolved around three main themes. The first one, when it came to defining our audience, we sort of thought about, to an extent, it comes down to the story that you're trying to tell. And we had some really interesting chat about thinking more carefully about the words that we use and how they might be interpreted, and how definitions might sort of be quite value laden. and how, for example, some terms might be defined in some ways, but for others defined in a completely different way. We talked about social media and what a powerful tool that is for communicating our research. And finally, we talked about art when it came to formats, and what a powerful bridge that is for communicating research to non-scientific audiences. And we had a nice example of public art and how that can be a very interactive experience. But I may have missed some stuff, so feel free to add to.
Amazing. Well, thank you for the summary. I think, well, I mean, I hope that with this exercise that we've done in the breakout room, one thing that you may have noticed is that, there's not one audience fits all. And I think that's really the key principle of science communication. Is very often people think like, oh, I just want to tell everyone about my project or my work. And actually, you kind of have to like narrow your audience down slightly so that you can then really pick up what's the best format. And even in the discussion we had in the previous hour, we talked about specific things to tailor communication to kids, or if you have a podcast, you kind of need to tailor it to like your audience and make sure that you don't use jargon if you want it to be for the general public. So hopefully all these this little exercise kind of like helped you get a bit of a thinking cap on when it comes to like your messages and who you're trying to reach with them, and then really get down to like the specific and what best format works for that specific audience that you've identified. So I hope it was helpful. And I think, I mean, Munib, let me know if there's anything that you wanted to add, but I think it might be a good time now to go into our wrap-up activity. And we just have a final Mentimeter, a little survey for you. I'm going to put the link in the chat now so that you'll be able to answer the question. I've lost the chat again. Oh, here it is. So if you go to the link I've just put in the chat, you will be able to tell us what is the key thing you've learned during the session. So please, again, feel free to use your first language. If it's not English, that's totally fine. And just let us know in like one or two, I think you can just put one word actually. So let us know in one word, what's the key thing that you've learned during this session? What is kind of like your key takeaway? And I'll put another link in there for you to be able to see the live results as well, because that's where the fun is. Let me put that here. I'll read some of the things that I see as well so that you can all see what's happening on there. So let me just open that. So I can see awareness, framing, multiple solutions, communication strategy, knowing your audience, yay, communication traps, optimism, values, yeah, all great answers. I mean, we're so happy that you all came to attend this session, and we hope that you enjoyed it. If you have any feedback on ways that we could improve on future workshop on that topics, or things that you particularly like, then please reach out to us and let us know. You can find us on the Wova app, or you can just drop us an email. I'll put the email address in the chat as well. So if you have any questions, or if you want to collaborate with Conservation Optimism or anything, if you want to reach out to us personally, you can send us an email at admin@conservationoptimism.org. So I'll put that in the chat now. And looking there, I can see a few more words have appeared. The value of positive communication, that's a nice one. Diverse means of communication. So yes, thank you all so much for attending. And Munib, did you have any final last word before we're closing this session?
I mean, just to say, yeah, thank you so much, everyone. It's amazing that 2 hours passed and I didn't even notice where this happened. Like, we could have gone on. And yeah, thank you for attending. I personally learned a lot, and I really hope we can, meet each other in person sometime in the near future and collaborate definitely towards more positive and inspiring stories for people and the planet.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for attending today, and have a nice rest of your day, no matter what time it might be where you are.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone. everyone. Bye.